I think the reality is, in the short term, we probably aren't going to get back as members of the single market, but it's something we shouldn't be scared to talk about.
Good old Brexit managed to cause absolute chaos in Malaga airport this week when an easyJet flight from Luton to Gibraltar was diverted at the last minute thanks to bad weather. When the plane landed, the passengers on board were told that only those with Spanish residency could get off because, obviously, the British passport holders no longer are European citizens and lost their rights for freedom of movement and light touch passport controls, and therefore they were told they'd have to wait on the tarmac until a flight could get them back to Luton, despite only being a few hours' drive from Gibraltar. Gibraltar, as we know, is a British overseas territory. So when you're flying from Britain to Gib, you don't need to go through passport control because it's like going from, London to Birmingham, I guess. And this flight had weather problems and had to land in Malaga. Malaga's in Spain. And we left the European Union. We're no longer European citizens. And so Spain decided to control its borders and said, we've got a plane that's arrived on the tarmac with a whole load of passengers who weren't meant to come and arrive here. So we don't know who they are and we control our country. So they told the people on the plane that anyone with a Spanish citizenship obviously could get off. Anyone else had to wait on the plane until a new plane was available to take them back to Luton. Well, the British people on this plane weren't happy about that. And it sounds as though, they described it as a mini British mutiny. And they all got off the plane and demanded that they be allowed to go through Malaga airport and travel to Gibraltar, which is only a couple of hours by taxi. But they were very upset about it and really wanted to blame Spain for treating them badly. Nobody thought to explain to them why anyone in Britain, if it was the other way around, given that we control our borders, if a plane arrived in Britain which was destined for another country and we didn't have clearance of who was on that plane, then of course we would do exactly the same. But the British exceptionalism, since Brexit in particular, expects to still have the benefits of being in the club whilst being out of the club and not actually facing the reality of what we did to ourselves, which was actually make life a lot more difficult for us, and particularly for any of the British citizens who live in these British overseas territories. As we know, the situation with the Chagos Islands has become very heated. The Brexiteers in particular, Mark Francois, one of my favourites, is going absolutely crazy about Labour handing over the Chagos Islands. Somebody please tell him it is not the Labour government's fault that this happened. It is because they did Brexit. Brexit handed away control of the Chagos Islands, and Brexit gave Argentina the power to believe that at some stage they can assert their authority over the Falkland Islands. And certainly the uncertainty over Gibraltar continues as those negotiations are not finalised, and finding a solution is not easy. Brexit did all of this.
Indian Ocean, under British control for more than 200 years, soon will be sovereign to Mauritius. An agreement between the two governments today, ending years of bitter dispute with a US naval base at its heart.
Crucially protects the national security interests of the United Kingdom and our allies, and this has been reached in full agreement with the United States, retaining the crucial base on Diego Garcia. Also closes down a potential route for migrants, and it also has important benefits for Chagossian communities as well.
The Chagos archipelago is made up of around 60 islands and has been under British control since 1814. Britain detached the group of islands from Mauritius before granting Mauritius independence in the 60s, later expelling the Chagos archipelago's population to allow the US to build a base on one of the islands of Diego Garcia, now the only inhabited island. This expulsion of more than 1,000 people has been fought in British courts and described as one of the darkest chapters in British colonial history, with islanders dumped on the dockside, their lawyers said, with no help in Mauritius and the Seychelles. The deal could pave the way for the islanders to return, although not to the largest island of Diego Garcia, where the jointly run UK-US base is located. Both Prime Ministers of the UK and Mauritius said the deal was a seminal moment. But today, a group of Chagosian islanders spoke to the Foreign Office and said they hadn't been consulted.
We want our self-determination. We want to decide what's the future of our island. But that's not been happening. The forced exile started in the 1960s. That was done in the Labour government. And they did it without engaging with the Chagossian community. And again, they have done the same thing by doing an agreement with Mauritius without engaging with the Chagossian community.
Mauritius has long claimed the Chagos Islands are part of its territory, and a non-binding resolution in the UN General Assembly in 2019 said overwhelmingly that Britain should give up control of the archipelago, so too its top court. In a statement, President Biden says he applauds the historic agreement, which he says affirms Mauritian sovereignty while securing the effective operation of the joint facility on Diego Garcia into the next century. British Foreign Secretary David Lammy said under the agreement, the base, which was used during the Gulf, Iraq and Afghanistan wars, would be secured for 99 years. Some Conservative MPs have argued against the deal.
The airbase, which is jointly UK-US operated, is maintained on a 99-year lease. The other outlying islands go back to Mauritian sovereignty. Now, there are many other countries which would be interested in a permanent base in the Indian Ocean, China being one of them.
And while Chagos Islanders won't be able to return to Diego Garcia, 60 asylum seekers stuck there in limbo still don't know when they can leave it. Rescued at sea by the British Navy and taken to the island in 2021, they're waiting for their claims to be processed. Their fate too is unclear, the treaty and its details still to be signed.
Well, joining me now is Jonathan Powell, the Prime Minister's special envoy for negotiations between the UK and Mauritius over the Chagos Islands. Jonathan Powell, first of all, what's taken so long?
Well, it took a long time under the last government. The previous government decided to start the negotiations under James Cleverly when he was Foreign Secretary. He deserves credit for that because our legal position was in jeopardy. They had 11 rounds and they didn't manage to get to agreement, partly because when David Cameron became Foreign Secretary, he put the whole thing on pause, and that destroyed trust with the Mauritian government, who thought the British government was playing games. So when the new Prime Minister came into office, Keir Starmer met with the Mauritian Prime Minister here in London in July, and they agreed they'd aim for a rapid agreement, much quicker than had happened before. And they had to happen before the Mauritian elections, which are imminent. Because then Mauritius goes into a period of purdah and then the period of elections itself, so it wouldn't be done before the end of the year.
Right.
So we were under a mandate to do this as quickly as we could, and that's what we've done.
Well, you've managed to anger quite a few people. Let's deal with some of the Conservative leadership candidates first. James Cleverly saying it's weak. Tom Tugendhat suggesting that China could establish a military base on one of the Chagos Islands. Are you worried by their criticisms?
Not at all. I actually think it's much more to do with the Tory leadership race than it is to do with the Chagos Islands, about which they haven't shown much interest in the past. I think the problem for James Cleverly is that he started these negotiations, and actually he deserves to be commended for doing that. So he's trying to defend himself from attack by the other candidates by saying that when he doesn't actually even know what's in the agreement. There's a long, detailed treaty, some of which was agreed while he was Foreign Secretary. So I don't take that terribly seriously.
Well,
Tom
the flaw in
Tugendhat's criticism is actually terribly ignorant.
OK, go ahead. No, I want to hear that.
Yeah, so he's saying China is a threat in this case. The whole point of this agreement is to secure the future of this base, which was under threat because our legal position was in jeopardy. And so we've secured it for 99 years with a renewal in the middle of next century. So it's there for a very, very long time. Anyone who knows anything about Mauritius knows Mauritius is very close indeed to India. And India has just, a short while ago, welcomed this agreement because they see it as a commitment to security in the Indian Ocean. It's also been welcomed by President Biden.
Yeah, but shouldn't you have secured assurances from the Mauritian government about the ownership of those other islands, that they're not going to sell them to China?
When you come to see the treaty, which will be concluded after, it is basically finished, but when you see it, when it's actually signed and then ratified, you'll see that it does take care of any of those concerns in the text that we have.
Right, so there are assurances on China getting involved in the treaty?
I'm not going to be specific about exactly what it says, but those worries are certainly laid to rest by this agreement. And bear in mind, this was all negotiated in consultation with the Americans, and if anyone's going to be worried about that, it's them.
OK, but there are a lot of Chagossians who are worried about this because they weren't consulted about this announcement for a start. I wonder why that is. But also they're worried that they're going to lose their identity now.
Well, the Chagossians were very badly treated by the British government in the 1960s and it deserves to be remedied. Now, there are lots of different Chagossian voices. The Chagossians in Mauritius, the Chagossians in Seychelles and here. And even the ones here have very different views on this subject. And it is right that we should try and remedy the wrong that was done to them, and that's what we're going to try and do. We've set up a very substantial fund, which will be administered by the Mauritian government. And we can't tell the Mauritian government to do what is now their territory. So they're going to arrange any resettlement that's possible. And we're also going to have action here to look after the Mauritians, to look after the Chagossians and make sure they can go back for visits. So we're trying to take care of this in every way we can, and they've already been offered a British citizenship, all of them, if they wish to have it. Most of them also have Mauritian citizenship as well. Well,
why weren't they consulted on this announcement? They feel very put out about that.
I think actually during the course of the negotiations, I think people have spoken to them. But obviously, this is a bilateral negotiation between two governments. You can't have them at the table from that point of view. Trying to remedy the wrong of the past is not going to be by sort of, you just have to come to an agreement and then you have to try and work out a way to help them over what's been done in the past.
Do you see this as a possible template for sort of future agreements? I mean, what about the Falklands, for example?
No, I don't actually. I think that the remaining overseas territories that Britain has are actually very sui generis, very separate, very different. The Falklands, for example, have a population. They have the right for self-determination. So if they don't want to be separated from the United Kingdom, they shouldn't happen to them. Other overseas territories have differences as well. So I don't think this is any precedent. Indeed, our lawyers say there are no precedents.
OK, but righting historical wrongs, you could at least return the Parthenon marbles to Greece. I mean, that seems to be a deal on that, seems to be in the offing.
That would be a separate negotiation, I think.
One you support?
I actually don't have a particularly strong view on it. I actually think it probably will be resolved fairly soon, yes.
Right. Jonathan Powell, thank you very much for joining us.
Yes. But this highlights the very difficult subject of Gibraltar and British overseas territories. They voted to remain for this very reason, because they understand how important it is to have freedom of movement with the EU. And the problem always with Brexit was that it was sold on a bed of lies, that we would be continuing our ability to freely move around the European Union and get Brexit with some extra gold-plated borders for ourselves, when actually it was always the opposite. It was a lose-lose situation for the Brits.
Quite clear that, all successful countries do the most trade with their nearest neighbours. It's one of the signs of success. We've got on our doorstep not just friends and colleagues and family indeed. We've got a market of more than 500 million people. The good news is the Prime Minister spent a lot of the last 3 months visiting friends in Europe, whether it's the President of France, the Prime Minister of Italy, the Chancellor of Germany, or the European Union indeed in Brussels. The current Brexit deal we have comes up for review next year. I'm hoping, unlike last time, there'll be closer alignment rather than divergence. We should be looking at a whole host of issues and talking about them, whether it's a youth mobility scheme, whether it's seeing what we can do to bring people closer together and stuff. I think the reality is, in the short term, we probably aren't going to get back as members of the single market, but it's something we shouldn't be scared to talk about.
Particularly in the financial services industry, very keen on closer alignment with Europe, and what can you offer there?
Well, what I'd say to our friends in Europe is, in a respectful way, London is the global city in Europe. Our competitors, I say in a respectful way, are Singapore, Hong Kong, New York. And I want to work with our European neighbours, and this government wants to work with our European neighbours to keep that investment, those jobs in Europe, and that means in London. We also want to have close alignment with the European Union, and I think what you'll see from the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, the Business Secretary and many others in the Cabinet is reaching out the hand of friendship with our European partners. In fact, David Lammy today is in mainland Europe having those conversations with friends in Europe. It's really important that we understand it's in both of our interests, the European Union and the UK, to have that closer alignment.
I think the issue that Labour's got is they don't want to reopen this issue of Brexit, as we very clearly saw in that interview over there. And where we are as a country, with sluggish growth, real productivity issues, one of the first things that you'd look to do is look at what you can do to reduce barriers to trade with your nearest trading bloc. Unfortunately, in the last 7 or so years, the UK has put up those trading barriers. It's absolutely bonkers when you look at what's been going on with our economy. But Labour obviously don't want to go there. Obviously, there are other things that you can do to try and boost growth. It's also very difficult, I think, because, it's not like we can go knocking on the EU's door and rejoin the single market and customs union tomorrow. I think that would be difficult, probably politically, but also from a substantive perspective. The EU's moved on from Brexit, but we can't get away from the fact that that we had an impact on leaving the EU had a big impact on trade and therefore on GDP.
But we've also had a sluggish growth for about 20 years. If you actually look at average growth around that time, big dips and what have you. And there was 2 years. There was 2 years hiatus after. There was a 2 years hiatus when we had that hiatus in Parliament
but you
as well.
Cannot deny that putting up trading barriers with your closest neighbour is not good economic
but that's a two-way street.
Every fiscal forecast by the Office for Budget Responsibility in recent years has talked about how it's a 4% hit to GDP.
But what I'm saying, but it's a two-way hit. So that's why we do need a mature relationship with the EU, but we also must look at the ASEAN countries and India and China as well.
What's interesting about that mature relationship, talking to EU diplomats in recent weeks, they say, look, that's lovely that Keir Starmer's smiling at us, that's really, really lovely. But they all say, what do you want in the UK? So Keir Starmer says, I'd like a veterinary agreement, which will ease some of the GB EU checks and the GBNI checks. We quite like that. And they say, oh, that's absolutely marvellous. And what do we get in return?